The world returned to him not as a gentle dawn, but as a brutal collision of sensations. A white-hot agony, throbbing in a sickening rhythm at the base of his skull, was the first and most insistent reality. Then came the fire in his wrists, a sharp, burning complaint where coarse fibers sawed into his flesh with every slight, involuntary twitch. He tried to move his hands, to flex his fingers, but they were bound fast behind him, anchored to something unyielding. Gideon Pratt opened his eyes to a world tilted on its axis, his vision swimming before focusing on a circle of faces looming above him. They were faces carved from weathered wood and hardened by a sun he could not yet feel, their expressions immobile, their eyes holding a flat, judgmental light that offered no quarter. The sun hung directly overhead, a merciless bronze coin in a cloudless, bleached-out sky. Its heat pressed down on him, a physical weight that seared his exposed neck and face. How many hours had passed? The last coherent memory surfaced through the pain like a bubble from a deep, dark well. The creek at sunset, the cool evening air carrying the scent of damp earth and willow, the soft, sucking sounds his horse made as it drank from the clear, cold water. He had dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft mud of the bank. Then, a sound behind him, a faint rustle, the whisper of displaced air. Then nothing, an explosion of pain, and the world had collapsed into a silent, suffocating darkness. Now he was here. Wherever here was, he managed to tilt his head back, the movement sending fresh jolts of pain through his neck. The wooden post he was tied to was thick, driven deep into the packed earth, a stark statement of permanence. Around him, the tribal camp stretched in all directions, a silent panorama of leather shelters and smoldering cook fires. The air was thick, not just with heat and wood smoke, but with a palpable, heavy silence. Men and women, their clothing a mix of tanned hides and rough-spun cloth, had gathered closer, forming a tightening, human wall around him. No one spoke. There was no shouted accusation, no angry curse. The silence was more terrifying than any noise, a collective, wordless verdict that had already been passed. He tried to speak, to force a question through his dry, cracked lips, but only a ragged breath escaped. His throat was a desert. His eyes, stinging from sweat and sun, scanned the ring of impassive faces, searching for a flicker of understanding, a hint of doubt. He found none, only a cold, simmering anger in some, a grim satisfaction in others, and in most, a simple, terrifying resolve. These people believed him guilty of something, a crime so grave it warranted this swift, brutal justice. And then he saw her. At the edge of crowd, slightly apart from the others, stood a young woman. Her dark hair fell in long, straight waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, unlike the others, were not fixed on him with blank judgment, but with a fierce, almost painful intensity. She held herself rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw set. She was not merely observing. She was waiting, her entire body coiled with a tension that seemed to vibrate in the still air. She knew something. He could see it in the way her gaze flickered from him to the crowd and back again, a silent debate raging behind her dark eyes. That knowledge, locked within her, was a spark in the overwhelming darkness of his predicament. It was a fragile, dangerous thing, this sudden, desperate hope, but it was all he had to cling to in the face of the silent, stone-faced condemnation that surrounded him. The ropes bit deeper, the sun burned hotter, and the weight of their collective gaze felt like a tombstone settling upon his chest. The circle of onlookers parted with a quiet, respectful rustle, a movement that held more weight than any spoken command. From this opening emerged a man who carried his authority like a second skin. He was older, his long hair streaked with iron gray, but it was his face that commanded attention. A web of thin, white scars crisscrossed his features, each line a pale testament to survived conflicts and hard-won battles. This was Takakota, the chief. His eyes, dark and penetrating, moved over Gideon's bound form with a dispassionate intensity, measuring, evaluating, and finding him wanting. His presence seemed to suck the very sound from the air, imposing a silence so profound that Gideon could hear the frantic thudding of his own heart against his ribs. This was the man who would decide his fate, and his expression offered no hope of mercy. Then, a second figure stepped into the circle, and Gideon's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. It was Royce Barrett. The man stood in stark, almost offensive contrast to everything around him. His shirt was clean and sharply pressed, his boots polished to a high shine, and his coat looked absurdly out of place amidst the dust and primal heat of the camp. Gideon knew that face. He had seen it 3 days ago at the trading post, flashing a smile that was too wide, laughing with a boisterousness that felt manufactured. Royce had been making easy promises, his voice a smooth, oily instrument. Now that same man positioned himself directly across from Gideon, and in the brief, fleeting moment their eyes met, Gideon understood the entire, terrible truth. This was no accident of mistaken identity. This was a trap meticulously laid, and he had walked into it with the blind trust of a man carrying nothing but honest intentions. Royce's face was a carefully constructed mask of solemn regret as he turned to address Takakota and the assembled tribe. He moved with a practiced theatrical grace, his gestures measured to convey a reluctant sense of duty. He began to weave his tale, his voice a low, sympathetic drone that carried false notes of sincerity. He painted a picture of pre-dawn shadows and suspicious movements, describing a figure he claimed to have seen skulking near the tribe's storage building. He spoke of seeing that same figure later, returning from the direction of the camp, carrying long, canvas-wrapped bundles that could only be one thing: rifles. Every word was a calculated lie, delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who had built his life on deception. He was not just accusing, he was performing, playing the part of the concerned citizen forced to speak an unpleasant truth. The performance reached its crescendo as Royce reached into his immaculate coat and produced a single, folded piece of paper. He handled it with theatrical reverence, presenting it to Takakota as if it were a sacred relic. The chief unfolded it, his scarred fingers tracing the writing. Gideon's heart plummeted, a stone sinking into a frozen lake. He recognized it instantly, a receipt from the trading post bearing his own signature. A mundane piece of paperwork, a standard acknowledgement for the delivery contract he had picked up. Now in Royce's cunning hands, it was being twisted into something sinister, a piece of damning evidence that placed him at the scene, granting him both the opportunity and, in their eyes, the motive. He had signed his own death warrant with a routine scrawl of his name. The plan was now brutally clear. Steal the tribe's most sacred possessions, the rifles that were their guarantee of protection, and a symbol of a fragile treaty, and pin the crime on a lone, helpless cowboy who had no one to vouch for him and nothing to offer in his defense but the truth, a currency that held no value here. A desperate, raw sound tore from Gideon's throat, a protest against the elegant lies that were suffocating him. He fought against the ropes, ignoring the fresh, searing pain as the fibers ground deeper into his already raw wrists. He poured out his story, the true one, about the peaceful evening at the creek, the sudden, shocking impact from behind, the world dissolving into nothingness. His words, rough and edged with panic, felt feeble against the polished performance Royce had delivered. He was a drowning man gasping for air in a sea of silent, hostile faces. Takakota listened, his expression unreadable, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Two warriors detached themselves from the crowd and moved with swift, purposeful strides toward the creek, their forms disappearing into the brush. For a terrible, stretched-out moment, a fragile hope flickered within Gideon's chest. If they found the spot, if they saw the disturbed earth, the evidence of a struggle, the crushed grass where he had fallen, then this nightmare could still end. The men returned far too quickly. Their steps were not those of men carrying exonerating evidence, but of soldiers returning with a confirmed report. They spoke to Takakota in low, hushed tones, their voices a mere murmur against the tense silence. The chief's face, already hardened, did not change, but a final, chilling certainty settled in his eyes as he turned his gaze back to Gideon. The ground near the creek, they reported, showed nothing. No signs of a fight, no scuff marks in the dirt, no telltale splash of blood on the stones. It was as pristine and untouched as if he had never been there. Of course it was. The realization was a physical blow. Whoever had attacked him had been meticulous, professional, carefully smoothing the earth, erasing any trace that might contradict the narrative Royce was so skillfully building. His hope shattered, leaving behind a cold, hollow void. Driven by a last, frantic instinct for self-preservation, Gideon seized on a different tack. He nodded desperately toward Royce, his voice cracking as he demanded they search the man's wagon. If Royce was so honest, so concerned for peace, he would have nothing to hide. The irony of the request, its fatal twist, would only reveal itself later. Royce's reaction was a masterpiece of deceit. He spread his hands in a gesture of open, wounded innocence, his face a mask of benevolent compliance. He welcomed the search, even encouraged it, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Gideon's desperate thrashing. Takakota, his options seemingly exhausted, gestured to two younger tribesmen. They moved toward Royce's wagon, a sturdy, dust-covered conveyance parked at the edge of the camp. Royce watched them go, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture radiating nothing but serene confidence. That confidence was the most terrifying thing Gideon had ever witnessed. The man wasn't worried. He had planned for this, too. The search was swift and methodical. The two men emerged from the wagon carrying a long, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. They brought it to the center of the circle and laid it at Takakota's feet, unfolding the fabric with a grim solemnity. There, gleaming dully in the harsh sunlight, lay 3 rifles. Not just any rifles, but the sacred, treaty-given weapons, the very soul of the tribe's protection, stolen from their storage. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd, followed by a low, rising wave of angry shouts and guttural curses. The evidence was now physically present, undeniable. Takakota raised his hands, quelling the outburst with a mere gesture, his voice like rolling thunder as he pronounced the obvious conclusion. The rifles were found in the wagon of this man, he declared, pointing at Royce, but his burning eyes remained locked on Gideon, hidden there by the one who stole them. The perfect, cruel brilliance of the scheme crashed down on Gideon. Royce had planted the rifles in his own wagon, knowing the tribe would search it, knowing they would be found, and knowing that everyone would logically assume the guilty man had hidden them there in a clumsy attempt to shift blame. It was a flawless, closed circle of guilt, and he was trapped at its center. The circle of faces, once stony, was now transformed into a visage of unified, raw fury. Hands moved to knife hilts and wooden clubs. Takakota's own hand went to the weapon at his belt, not yet drawing it, but the intention was as clear as the cloudless sky above. The judgment had been made. The sentence was now to be carried out. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the grim finality of the moment. Takakota's hand rested on the hilt of his knife, his gaze fixed on Gideon with an impersonal resolve that was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. The crowd, a single, seething entity of vengeance, pressed in closer, their collective breath held for the swift execution of justice. Gideon's world had shrunk to the post at his back, the ropes on his wrists, and the cold, accepting certainty of his own end. He closed his eyes, shutting out the ring of hardened faces, retreating into a final, private darkness. It was in that suspended silence, as sharp and fragile as glass, that a single figure broke from the periphery. Nala moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that cut through the tension. She did not rush, nor did she hesitate. Her steps were measured and firm, carrying her past the front line of onlookers, past the warriors, and directly into the center of the circle. She positioned herself between her father and the bound cowboy, her slender back straight, her shoulders squared, a living barrier against the impending violence. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the tribe, but she stood immovable, her dark eyes not on her father, but locked with an unnerving intensity on Royce Barrett. Takakota's expression shifted from grim duty to stunned disbelief, then to a flash of warning anger. He spoke her name, a low, commanding sound that had always, until this moment, been obeyed. It was a clear order to return to her place, to remain within the boundaries of her station. She ignored him. Her entire being was focused on the well-dressed man who wore a mask of wounded virtue. For a long moment, she simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, forcing every eye to settle upon her. Then she began to speak, her voice not loud, but clear and unwavering, carrying to the farthest edges of the gathering. She painted a different picture, one of soft, pre-dawn light and lingering shadows. She spoke of returning from a solitary hunt in the eastern hills, her movements silent, her senses attuned to the waking forest. It was then that she had seen a figure moving near the sacred storage building, a place no outsider should be. At first, she had assumed it was one of their own, perhaps an early rising sentry, and so she had remained hidden, not wishing to disturb them. But something in the figure's movements had felt wrong, too furtive, too deliberate, lacking the natural ease of a tribesman going about his duties. A cold dread had settled in her stomach as she watched, frozen and unseen, as the figure worked the lock, slipped inside, and emerged moments later carrying 3 long, canvas-wrapped shapes. She described, with chilling detail, how the thief had carried the stolen rifles away from the camp, not toward the settlement, but toward the creek, moving with a careful, practiced stealth. She had watched him bury the bundle deep within a thicket of willow bushes, his hands scooping away earth, and then carefully replacing the foliage, erasing all signs of his crime. The light had been poor, the distance great, and she had not seen his face clearly enough to be certain, only the cut of his clothes and the shape of his figure. It was a seed of truth, but a seed she could not plant without absolute certainty. She had carried the burden of that knowledge for days, a silent, gnawing witness, waiting for a sign, for a confirmation that would transform her suspicion into unshakable fact. That confirmation had arrived with Royce Barrett himself, standing before the tribe, weaving his tapestry of lies with such smooth, practiced confidence. He had given her the final piece of the puzzle. Seeing him there, hearing the false sympathy in his voice, and watching the theatrical flourish of his gestures, the dimly remembered silhouette from that morning had snapped into perfect, horrifying focus. It was him. The certainty had flooded her cold and clear. She would not, could not, let an innocent man die for the crime she had seen this other commit. Her gaze never wavered from Royce as she finished her account, her voice gaining a hard, flint-like edge. She took 3 final steps forward, closing the distance between them until she was so close he could not avoid her eyes. The air crackled. She leaned in slightly, and into the breathless silence she uttered 4 simple, devastating words that carried the weight of an entire truth. "I saw you do it." The effect was instantaneous and electric. The words hung in the air not as an accusation, but as an absolute, unassailable statement of fact. For 3 long heartbeats, there was no sound at all. Then, the carefully constructed facade on Royce Barrett's face fractured. It was just for an instant, a flicker of panic in his eyes, a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth. But it was enough. The mask had slipped, and beneath it was the calculating, cornered face of the guilty man. The silence that followed Nala's declaration was more profound and more damning than any roar of the crowd. It was a vacuum, sucking the air from the circle and leaving in its place a terrible, suspended stillness. All eyes were locked on Royce Barrett, and in that moment, the polished veneer of the concerned benefactor shattered completely. The feigned hurt, the mask of righteous indignation, it all sloughed away like dead skin, revealing the cold, hard calculation beneath. His eyes, once full of false sympathy, now darted around the encircling faces with the sharp, frantic energy of a trapped animal assessing its cage. He tried to speak, to summon another lie, but the words died in his throat, strangled by the absolute certainty in the young woman's gaze. He was no longer an accuser. He was a specimen under a microscope, and every person present could now see the disease festering within. Takakota did not need to hear more. The truth was written in the sudden pallor of Royce's face, in the barely perceptible tremor in his hands, in the way his body coiled defensively. The chief's own rage, previously directed at the bound cowboy, now found its true target, and it was a cold, terrifying thing. He did not shout. He simply turned his head and gave a single, sharp command to the warriors flanking him. Their movements were swift and efficient. They seized Royce by his arms, their grips like iron, and he was suddenly just a man, his fine clothes and polished boots offering no protection against their strength. The crowd, which had been a unified front of anger against Gideon, now seethed with a new, confused energy, the tide of their fury turning, but not yet knowing where to land. Takakota's order was clear and left no room for deception. He commanded a full search of the wagon, instructing his men to tear it apart, to examine every plank, every container, every hidden compartment. For tribesmen descended upon the conveyance with a methodical, vengeful precision. They were not merely looking for the stolen rifles this time. They were hunting for the root of the rot. They pulled up floorboards, ripped open seat cushions, and emptied every bag and trunk. The sound of splintering wood and tearing fabric filled the air, a violent symphony that underscored the unraveling of Royce's grand design. He stood rigid in the grip of the warriors, his earlier calm replaced by a tense, sweating anxiety. His eyes followed the destruction of his wagon with a kind of horrified fascination, the color draining from his face with each new splintering crack. It did not take long. One of the searchers, a young man with a grim expression, let out a sharp call. He had discovered a cleverly concealed space beneath a false bottom in the wagon bed. From this hidden recess, he pulled out a leather satchel, worn but of fine quality, the kind used by lawyers and land speculators for important documents. He carried it to Takakota and presented it with a solemn air. The chief took the satchel, his scarred fingers working the brass clasp. He withdrew a sheaf of papers, their surfaces covered in dense, official-looking script and adorned with stamped seals. He began to read, his eyes scanning the lines, and with each word, his expression transformed. The anger did not leave, but it was joined by something colder, darker, and more dangerous, the ice-cold fury of profound betrayal. He held the first document up for the crowd to see, his hand trembling not with weakness, but with a contained storm. These were not just papers, they were land contracts, deeds of sale for the very valley they stood in, for the ancestral lands that had been theirs for generations. The documents claimed that Chief Takakota had willingly agreed to relocate his people, that he had signed away their birthright. And there, at the bottom of the page, was a crude forgery of his mark, his signature. A wave of shocked understanding swept through the tribe, murmurs of disbelief giving way to growls of pure, undiluted rage. The entire monstrous scheme was laid bare. Royce hadn't just stolen rifles to frame a man, he had stolen them to start a war. By making the tribe believe a settler had committed an act of war, he would provoke a violent retaliation. That retaliation would give the territorial authorities the perfect excuse to move in, remove the hostile tribe by force, and clear the land. The forged contracts would then be activated, the land sold to waiting mining companies, and Royce would pocket a fortune, all built on a foundation of innocent blood and shattered lives. The trap he had built for Gideon had, in a breathtaking twist of justice, snapped shut around its creator. The warriors tightened their grip on his arms, and for the first time, genuine, unadulterated fear shone in Royce Barrett's eyes. He was no longer the puppeteer, he was the pawn, and the game was over. A sharp, clean pressure, and then a sudden, shocking release. The world rushed back into Gideon's wrists as the ropes fell away, the feeling returning in a painful, prickling flood that was more beautiful than any sensation he had ever known. He brought his hands forward, staring at the raw, bloody grooves etched into his skin, the physical proof of a nightmare from which he had just awoken. The circle of hostile faces had dissolved, its energy redirected toward the true architect of the deception. Royce Barrett, his fine clothes now dusty and disheveled, sat bound and under heavy guard, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sullen, defeated silence. The tribe's justice, swift and brutal moments before, had transformed into something more measured, more potent. Takakota had spoken not of execution, but of law. Riders had already been dispatched to the territorial authorities, carrying with them the damning evidence of the forged land contracts and a formal account of Royce's conspiracy. He would face a white man's court for his crimes, a fate that perhaps stung his pride more than a quick blade ever could. His horse, found grazing peacefully near the creek as if nothing had happened, was brought to him. The familiar weight of his saddle, the scent of leather and horseflesh, grounded him in a reality he thought he had lost forever. As he checked his saddlebags, finding his meager possessions and the payment for his delivery work untouched. The simple coins felt insignificant, the currency of a life that no longer felt entirely his. It was then that Nala approached. She moved silently, her presence a calm eddy in the still charged air of the camp. In her hands, she carried a cloth-wrapped bundle, which she extended to him without a word. He took it, his own hands still trembling slightly, and unfolded a corner to reveal dried meat and flatbread, provisions for the journey ahead. It was more than food. It was an apology, an acknowledgement, a silent bridge built between their two worlds. He looked at her, trying to find words that could encompass the debt he felt, the gratitude that threatened to overwhelm him. He started to speak, to thank her for her courage, to apologize for the chaos his presence had brought. But she met his gaze, and in the deep, quiet understanding he saw there, words became superfluous. She had not spoken out for gratitude or reward. She had spoken because it was the truth, and the truth, once known, demanded a voice. Her courage had not been a sudden impulse, but a slow, steady burn that had waited for the right moment to ignite. He secured the provisions to his saddle, the simple task feeling like a ritual, a closing of a terrible chapter. Takakota emerged from his dwelling and walked toward them, his expression no longer that of a stern judge, but of a leader who had stared into an abyss and stepped back. He placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, a gesture filled with a pride that transcended the moment. He then looked at Gideon, and his words were simple, final. He was free to go. No debt remained. What had happened was the work of one man's greed, not a conflict between their peoples. It was a distinction that would save the valley. Gideon pulled himself into the saddle, the leather creaking a familiar song. He gathered the reins, the horse shifting eagerly beneath him, sensing the open trail. He looked down at Nala one last time, and a silent communication passed between them, a recognition of a bond forged in the crucible of truth and near disaster. He turned the horse toward the valley's entrance, and as he rode away, he did not look back at the camp, but at the land itself, the rolling hills, the shimmering creek, the stands of willow that had hidden both the crime and its evidence. The valley was safe not because of guns or treaties, but because a young woman had found the strength to speak for simple words. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, and Gideon Pratt, a man who was nobody special, rode on. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his life had been saved by a truth that cost only 4 words to speak. The memory of those words would ride with him, a quiet, enduring companion on the long, open road ahead.